Hello everyone, welcome to our next English session. Today we're going to be working on relative clauses. So we're going to talk through what they are, we're going to look through some examples, then there's going to be a few activities where you're asked to write some relative clauses, and then there will be an activity at the end which will be linked to an assignment on Teams. So before we start looking at relative clauses altogether, we need to have a look at relative pronouns. So hopefully you remember a pronoun is something that replaces a noun. So if you've got the name, for example, Sarah, you could replace that with she, her, I, they, dependent on the sentence. Relative pronouns are used differently to other pronouns. They introduce a relative clause. And relative pronoun examples that we have are who, which, where, when, whose, and that. So we're going to have a look at how we can use those relative pronouns to introduce our relative clauses. So relative pronouns can relate to the clause to a noun, so linking it to a noun. So here we have a sentence where old Deuteronomy, who was sleepy, licked his tail. So old Deuteronomy is a character, and it's underlined because that is the noun, and then the word in bold is the relative pronoun. So the original sentence was old Deuteronomy licked his tail, but we've added more information there by splitting up our main clause, the clause that makes sense on its own, and inserting a relative clause. We've used the word who because it's referring to a person or a character. Let's have a look at another example. Old Deuteronomy licked his tail, which he coiled towards him. So you'll notice here that the noun is tail and the relative pronoun is which. So here we have the relative clause being linked onto the end of a sentence. So the main clause there is old Deuteronomy licked his tail. So that you could have that on its own, but we've added some extra information by adding the relative clause which he coiled towards him. The next example is old Deuteronomy, whose tongue was very rough, licked his tail. And hopefully you can see that without that relative clause, that main clause, old Deuteronomy licked his tail, would make sense on its own. So what we've done there is we've split the sentence, and next to the noun, we've inserted our relative clause to add more information about that noun. Another example that we can look at is old Deuteronomy licked the bite. So the bite is the noun there that the mouse had given him. So once again, the relative pronoun is bold and the relative clause is that the mouse had given him. So just once again, examples of relative pronouns are who, which, where, when, whose, and that. So relative clauses can also relate to a whole clause. So it might not just be linking to a noun, it might be talking about the whole clause. So there's some examples here. The cat caught the canary. So this is a clause. So it's a phrase, that we call that a clause. The cat caught the canary, which annoyed its owner. So here, it's not the cat which has annoyed the owner. It's the catching of the canary which has annoyed it. So the relative clause relates to the whole clause. So the whole action of the cat catching the canary is what is annoying the owner there. So this is just a bit of revision of some things you have looked at before. Relative clauses are introduced in Year 5, but subordinate clauses, we usually start seeing them in Year 3. So we're just going to talk about them here. So Gumby slept on the bed, which was a very comfortable one. So the main clause there is Gumby slept on the bed. That could be a sentence on its own. The subordinate clause, which is adding extra information and would not make sense on its own, is which was a very comfortable one. So once again, the main clause is the main part of the sentence and it makes sense by itself. The subordinate clause adds meaning So the main clause has less weight, so it's less important, just adding on extra meaning or extra information about that main clause. When the subordinate clause is a relative clause, it adds meaning to a noun in the main clause or to the whole main clause. So we're just going to work now on how we can spot relative clauses. So for this activity, you're going to be identifying the main clause and the relative clause in each sentence and figuring out what noun is the relative clause relating to. So for the sentence, old Deuteronomy stretched in the sunlight, which was warm and comforting, what you need to do is identify which part of that is the main clause, the bit that makes sense on its own, and which part of that is adding extra information, which wouldn't make sense on its own, as well as identifying the noun that's having information added about it. So I'll just give you a bit of time there so you could pause it and have a think about that. What's the main clause, what's the relative clause, and what's the noun? And then we've got another sentence which you can think about, and that sentence is Gumby sat on the hat which she had found on the hall table. So once again, just pause the video here, figure out what is the main clause, what is the relative clause, and what is the noun that's having that extra information added about it. So we're just going to look at the answers now. So just a reminder that you are identifying the main clause and relative clause in each sentence and the noun that the relative clause is linking to or relating to. So the main clause in the first sentence is old Deuteronomy stretched in the sunlight. And the subordinate clause, or the relative clause, which was warm and comforting. And the noun in there that's having the extra information added about it is sunlight, because it's the sunlight which was warm and comforting. The next sentence, the main clause, is Gumby sat on the hat. And the subordinate or relative clause is which she had found on the hall table. And hopefully you selected, that line's gone a little bit wrong, hopefully you selected that hat was the noun that was having more information added about it. So when we're thinking about punctuating relative clauses, we have to think about different things. If the relative clause comes after the main clause, we do not usually separate the clause with a comma. So for this sentence, we have old Deuteronomy ignored the noise which was coming towards him. So the main clause there is old Deuteronomy ignored the noise, and the subordinate clause or relative clause is which was coming towards him. If you add a comma in there, it creates an unnecessary break in the sentence. Sometimes we would use it, but you do not need it. When you are embedding relative clauses within the main clause, so that means sort of splitting the main clause up and putting the relative clause inside it, which we'll see in a second, you have to think about it slightly differently. Sometimes the relative clause is embedded in the main clause. So let's have a look at an example here. So the mice ate the cheese. So that's our main clause. And to tell the reader more about the mice, we're going to add a relative clause. And that relative clause needs to be next to the noun, which is the mice. So what we've done here is we're going to split that main clause and put a relative clause in the middle. Sorry, keep pressing the wrong button. You can see that we're going to move it and make some space to allow us to put a relative clause in the middle. So what we've done here, we've split that main clause, which was the mice ate the cheese. So now we have the mice, and then we've inserted our subordinate or relative clause in the middle. The mice who were happy to have tasty food ate the cheese. So now we'd say, is it put in the middle or embedded? And we put commas to split that main clause up. And that is because the relative clause breaks up the main clause. So if we look here, we've got some main clauses. So we have Gumby slept on the papers. we have the dog skirted around old Deuteronomy. We have the bed looked tempting to the cat. And we have the mouse ate all the cheese and bacon. So as a short activity now, you have your main clauses and the nouns, they have been highlighted in bold, so it's the thicker writing. What I'd like you to do now is to add extra information about those nouns using relative clauses. So you'll have to split those main clauses and embed your own relative clauses. Remember, they can begin with those relative pronouns that we talked about, like which, who, that, whose, and you can scroll back if you have forgotten what those are. So just give yourself a few minutes just to rewrite those sentences with some relative clauses in them. And you can just jot that down on some paper just so you can see, and we'll compare that to what we've come up with on the next slide. So just take a few minutes to do that and then start the video again. Okay, so let's just look at some examples here that we might have come up with. So we have our relative clause, remember, was Gumby slept on the papers. And we have split that main clause and embedded into it our relative clause. And we have, from that, got Gumby, who was tired after a busy night, slept on the papers. The next sentence, remember, our main clause was the dog skirted around old Deuteronomy. And we have split that and embedded inside some commas a relative clause. The relative clause is who did not want to disturb his sleep. So together we have the sentence, the dog who did not want to disturb his sleep skirted around old Deuteronomy. Third example, we have got, remember our main clause was the bed looked tempting to the cat. We have split that main clause and inserted the relative clause which had been made that very morning. So we have a sentence that reads, the bed, which had been made that very morning, looked tempting to the cat. And our last sentence, where we have embedded a relative clause, the main clause was the mouse ate all the cheese and bacon. And we thought that was a little bit boring, so we have added some extra information with the relative clause whose stomach had been rumbling. So our sentence now reads, the mouse, comma, to enclose that relative clause, whose stomach had been rumbling, comma, to close off that relative clause, ate all the cheese and bacon. So if you've written your own sentences with relative clauses, just check your punctuation and make sure you have a comma at the beginning of your relative clause and at the end. Okay, so we're going to move on to your activity for the day, and this activity will be posted onto Teams, so you can write your sentences on there, and then I can give you some feedback about them. So your main activity today is to write 6 sentences that include relative clauses, and you can post these on Teams, as I've mentioned, or if you're having a few issues with Teams and you would prefer to post them on Tapestry, that's absolutely fine. I'm still checking that very regularly throughout the day. If you would like to have a further challenge on top of those 6 sentences, I would like you to challenge yourself to choose a picture to describe and write some paragraphs using relative clauses in your sentences. So you might look on the internet for somewhere that you'd really like to visit, find a photo of it, and then start describing it. You could think about using some of the figurative language that we've used in our last lesson last week. You could think about using your short sentences and your dashes to emphasize things. And then just including some relative clauses in your paragraphs as well. I'd really love to see some of your writing. And just finally, just a few more examples that I have written for this picture here. Just some different types of relative clauses put in different places in the sentences. So I'm going to read through those before I let you get on with your activities. So my first sentence is the cat, which was as black as midnight, clawed at the window. So you can see that my main clause there, I've written in black, the cat clawed at the window. And I've split that main clause and embedded my relative clause, which was as black as midnight. In my next sentence, you'll notice that once again the main clause is in black. There was a small cat staring out of the window, And my relative clause is once again in red. That caught the witch's attention. So there I haven't put in my comma because remember that's just an unnecessary pause. And that relative clause isn't just referring to the cat, it's referring to the cat staring out of the window. So that relative clause is linked to that whole main clause. And my last example is another example of an embedded relative clause, which reads, the witch, who was seated atop her broom, looked longingly at the furry creature. So there's my examples. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what examples you come up with, especially if you write your own paragraphs to describe something.